Savage Arms made millions from his cartridges. The man who designed them died bankrupt 3 times over. His name was Charles Newton. He was not a hobbyist. He was not a weekend tinkerer with a lathe in his garage. He was one of the most gifted ballistics engineers in American history. A man who understood interior and exterior ballistics at a level that the established industry would not catch up to for another 40 years. He gave Savage Arms 2 of the most commercially successful cartridges the company ever produced. In return, Savage gave him nothing. No royalty, no contract, no credit. They took his work, put it into production, and told him to find the door. By the time Charles Newton died in 1932, Savage had sold hundreds of thousands of rifles chambered in his designs. Newton died with no estate worth speaking of. He had been through bankruptcy proceedings more times than most men file their taxes. The products outlived the man who created them. The company that stole them is still in business today. This is how it happened. Charles Newton was born in 1871 in Allegheny County, New York. He was a farm boy who taught himself to shoot before he was old enough to carry a rifle without resting it on a fence post. By the time he was 12, he was pulling apart factory ammunition and repacking his own loads, adjusting powder charges by feel and result rather than any formal instruction. He had no access to a ballistics library. He had a rifle, a scale, and an instinct for pressure that would eventually put him decades ahead of every engineer in the American gun trade. As a young man, Newton apprenticed under 2 of the finest barrel makers of the era. Harry Pope of Jersey City was widely regarded as the best barrel maker alive, a craftsman who could cut a rifling groove to tolerances that the machinery of the day was not supposed to be capable of achieving. Newton absorbed everything Pope could teach him about twist rates, groove depth, and the relationship between bore geometry and bullet stability at high velocity. He then spent time under Harry Stebbins, another master who reinforced Newton's conviction that the factory standard American sporting rifle was leaving enormous performance on the table. What Newton took from those apprenticeships was not just technique, it was a philosophy. Pope and Stebbins both believed that the American firearms industry was building to a price point rather than a performance standard. The factory guns coming out of the major manufacturers were adequate. They were not optimal. The barrels were cut to twist rates, chosen for ease of manufacture rather than for what the bullet actually needed. The chambers were dimensioned for tolerances wide enough to accommodate the sloppiest hand loading rather than for accuracy. Newton came away from those years convinced that the hunting public was being sold a deliberate compromise and told it was the best available. He spent the next 3 decades trying to prove there was another way. By the time Newton approached Savage Arms in the early years of the 20th century, he was not a young man with a rough idea. He was a trained craftsman with a fully worked-out ballistic theory, a set of hand-drawn chamber specifications, and a cartridge design that no one in the American commercial market had yet produced. The cartridge was a .22 caliber. Newton had designed it around a 70-grain bullet at a muzzle velocity of over 2,800 feet per second. That figure needs to be put in context. In 1902, the dominant American sporting cartridges were the .30-30 Winchester and the .38-55. Both pushed relatively heavy bullets at velocities below 2,000 feet per second. The idea of a .22 caliber cartridge moving a bullet at nearly 3,000 feet per second was, to the conventional thinking of that era, either a fiction or a catastrophe waiting to happen. Newton's calculations said otherwise. He had worked out the pressure curve, the twist rate, the case capacity, and the bullet construction required to make the round work reliably in a repeating rifle. The case was a bottleneck design with enough powder capacity to achieve the velocity without pushing chamber pressure beyond what a well-made lever action could sustain. Newton had thought through every variable, and he presented the design to Savage with a complete technical brief. Savage took the cartridge. They designated it the 22 Savage High Power and chambered it in their Model 99 lever-action rifle. The round went into commercial production. It would eventually become one of the most talked-about cartridges of the Edwardian era, marketed aggressively in both North America and the British colonies as a flat-shooting, hard-hitting round capable of taking game far larger than a .22 caliber had any business taking. Safari hunters took it to Africa. Canadian guides chambered it for wolves and deer. The British sporting press debated whether a .22 caliber bullet moving that fast constituted a humane deer cartridge or a dangerous gimmick. It was neither. It was exactly what Newton said it was. Newton received nothing. No licensing fee, no royalty arrangement, no employment offer. Savage classified the cartridge as a company development and moved on. Newton was left standing outside the factory with his briefcase and his calculations. He came back. That was the thing about Charles Newton. He came back. In 1911, he approached Savage with a second design. If the .22 had seemed radical in 1902, the new cartridge was something else entirely. Newton had designed a .25 caliber round built on a larger case, pushing an 87-grain bullet at a muzzle velocity that would exceed 3,000 feet per second. He called it the 250-3000. The name itself, a statement of performance. 3,000 feet per second from a sporting rifle in 1911 was not merely fast. It was a figure that most engineers in the industry would have told you was physically unachievable without destroying the rifle and the shooter along with it. Newton's design achieved it. The case was larger than anything Savage had chambered to that point. A rimless bottleneck design with a shoulder angle steep enough to minimize case stretch under the pressures required. The bullet was a Spitzer, pointed rather than round-nosed, which allowed it to retain velocity at distance far better than the blunt projectiles most hunters were using. At 300 yards, the 250-3000 was still moving faster than the 30-30 was at the muzzle. That was not marketing language. That was what the ballistic tables showed when you ran the numbers. The chamber specifications were correct. The pressure was within limits that a well-made bolt-action rifle could handle. The ballistic advantage over existing hunting cartridges in the 250 caliber range was not marginal. It was enormous. For a deer hunter or an elk hunter looking at shots beyond 200 yards, no factory cartridge in 1911 came close to what Newton had put on paper. Savage took the cartridge. They renamed it the 250-3000 Savage. They chambered it in a new rifle and marketed it on the strength of that 3,000 feet per second figure with the kind of enthusiasm they had never shown for Newton himself. The round became a commercial success. Hunters across North America bought into the velocity promise, and the cartridge delivered. It was everything Newton said it would be. Newton again received nothing. If you have spent any time behind a bolt gun in deer camp and wondered why the cartridges that actually changed hunting never seemed to carry the names of the men who built them, this channel exists for that question. Subscribe now. Every story we tell ends with the same answer, and none of them are comfortable. By 1914, Charles Newton had made his decision. He would build the rifles himself. He had no backing from the established industry. He had no access to Pope or Stebbins, who were by then under exclusive arrangement with Savage and unavailable to a competitor. What Newton had was his own knowledge, a rented factory floor in Buffalo, New York, and a conviction that the American hunting public was being underserved by cartridges designed to the lowest common denominator of what the factories were willing to make. Newton Arms Company opened for business in 1914. Newton designed his own rifle to go with his own cartridges. The action was a controlled feed bolt design built around a large claw extractor that pulled the cartridge under positive control from the magazine to the chamber to the ejection port. It was the same mechanical principle that would later define the pre-64 Winchester Model 70, the rifle American hunters would eventually call the rifleman's rifle. Newton was building it in Buffalo 15 years earlier, without the Winchester name and without Winchester's capital. The cartridges were his own Newton line, including the 220 Newton, the 256 Newton, and eventually the 300 Newton, all of them high-velocity, large case designs, pushing bullets faster than anything the major manufacturers were offering. The 300 Newton in particular was a serious piece of work. It pushed a 180-grain bullet at over 2,900 feet per second, making it among the most powerful commercial bolt-action cartridges available in North America at the time. Newton priced the rifle competitively with the major manufacturers and began taking orders. The company produced approximately 2,400 rifles before the money ran out. 16 months after opening, Newton Arms Company was in receivership. The failure was not because the rifles were bad. The surviving Newton rifles are, by the assessment of every collector and historian who has examined them, exceptional pieces of work. The failure was a combination of factors that would have tested a better capitalized operation than Newton could put together. Without access to Pope or Stebbins, Newton was forced to source barrels from secondary suppliers whose quality control was inconsistent. Several rifles left the factory with chamber dimensions that were slightly off specification. In a high-pressure cartridge, slightly off is enough. There were failures. There were burst chambers. There were returns. The complaints reached the gun press. Dealers who had stocked Newton rifles began returning them. For a small company with no margin for error and no institutional backing to weather a reputational crisis, the damage was fatal. Newton reorganized. In May of 1916, he incorporated the Newton Arms Corporation, a new entity backed by investors from Boston who had examined his technical case and concluded that the underlying product was sound even if the first execution had been flawed. The recapitalization brought in $200,000, enough to retool the factory, tighten the quality specifications, and begin production on a revised rifle. The new model was chambered for the 256 Newton. It was, by any objective measurement available at the time, the most capable commercial sporting rifle being produced in North America. The bolt was smooth, the trigger was clean, the cartridge was accurate and fast. Newton had spent 15 years designing toward this rifle. He was finally building it in volume. Orders were coming in. The future looked different than it had in months. 16 months later, the Newton Arms Corporation was bankrupt. The cause this time was not product quality. It was history. The United States entered the First World War in April of 1917. The federal government began directing raw materials, skilled labor, and manufacturing capacity toward military production. Newton's workforce scattered, his steel supply dried up. The investors who had backed him had no appetite for riding out a wartime shutdown with no end date in sight. By November of 1917, the second Newton Company was finished. Meanwhile, Savage Arms secured government contracts and kept its factory floors running at full capacity through the war years. The 253,000 Savage was by now a proven commercial cartridge with a national distribution network behind it. The company that had taken Newton's designs without paying for them was in the strongest financial position in its history. Newton was closing up the Buffalo facility. Savage was running full production. Newton did not stop. He should have, by any reasonable accounting of his situation. He was past 40, twice bankrupt, with no savings and no institutional support. He had watched two companies built on his own designs fail, while the company that had taken those designs without compensation continued to profit from them. Any rational assessment of his position pointed in one direction. It was over. The market had spoken. Newton was not interested in the market's assessment. He tried twice more. In 1919, he made an attempt to re-enter the market with a revised Newton rifle through a new corporate arrangement. That effort collapsed before it reached meaningful production. The post-war economy was contracting. Returning veterans were flooding the labor market. And the major manufacturers were cutting prices to clear wartime inventory. There was no room for a small independent operation without either a price advantage or a distribution network. And Newton had neither. In 1923, he patented a new design around a large .30 caliber Magnum cartridge and attempted to bring it to market through the Buffalo Newton Rifle Company. The industry press was not kind. The round was ahead of its time in the same way all of Newton's work had been ahead of its time, which in the commercial firearms trade of the 1920s meant it was treated as a liability rather than an asset. The company did not survive. Newton made one final attempt in 1928. He incorporated the Newton Arms Company of New Haven, Connecticut, and announced production of what he described as the strongest commercial bolt action available in America, chambered in calibers up to .35. He had a design. He had a factory space. He did not have time. On October 29th, 1929, the New York Stock Exchange collapsed. The Newton Arms Company of New Haven was insolvent within weeks. Charles Newton died in 1932. He was 61 years old. His estate was effectively nothing. He had been through bankruptcy proceedings 4 times in 18 years. The man who had handed Savage 2 of its most profitable cartridges died without enough in his account to matter. Think about a rifle you have owned that felt right from the moment you picked it up. Not a modern production gun with cast parts and a lawyer-designed trigger. A rifle that someone actually thought about, from the extractor to the stock, fit to the way the bolt closes. If you have owned one, you know exactly what that feels like. Tell me in the comments what it was and where you took it. This audience has been there. I want to hear it. In the decades after Newton's death, the industry he had tried to enter caught up to every claim he had ever made. It did not happen quickly. It did not happen with any acknowledgement of where the ideas had come from. It happened the way the industry always absorbed the ideas of the men it had discarded. Quietly, and without credit. The large-case, high-velocity design philosophy Newton had pursued since 1902 became the defining feature of American hunting cartridges in the post-war era. The .300 Winchester Magnum, introduced in 1963, used a case architecture Newton had been working with in 1914. The 7mm Remington Magnum, introduced the same year, followed the same logic. The .264 Winchester Magnum, which touched off a controversy about overbore capacity that the gun press debated for a decade, was built on principles Newton had been applying before the First World War. The industry arrived at Newton's conclusions on its own schedule, through its own process, and presented them as its own discoveries. None of those cartridges mentioned Newton. None of the engineers who developed them cited him. The ideas had passed into the general body of ballistic knowledge with no attribution attached. That is how the gun trade handled the men it could not profit from directly. It waited them out, buried them in debt, and then quietly built its next generation of products on their foundations. The .253,000 Savage stayed in Savage's catalogue until 1961, 50 years in production. The round took deer in every state in the Union and elk from Wyoming to British Columbia. It is, by the assessment of most historians of American cartridge development, one of the 10 most influential sporting cartridges ever produced in North America. P. Ackley improved it by steepening the shoulder angle to reduce case stretch and increase powder capacity, and the resulting cartridge became a Bankrupt and varmint standard that is still in wide use today. Winchester necked the case down to produce the .243 Winchester. Introduced in 1955, one of the best-selling deer cartridges of the 20th century and still among the most popular chamberings for first-time deer hunters across the country. The .253,000 Savage sits at the root of a family tree that includes cartridges still being loaded, still being chambered, and still taking game across North America more than a century after Newton handed the original design to a company that gave him nothing in return. Charles Newton's name is on none of them. His rifles sell at auction for $10,000 to $15,000 when examples in good condition come to market. Collectors who have examined surviving Newton rifles consistently note the quality of the metalwork, the precision of the chamber dimensions, and the sophistication of the action design relative to what American manufacturers were producing at the same time. The rifles were not failures. The company was a failure. Those are two entirely different things. The product was everything Newton promised. The institution behind it could not survive the combination of undercapitalization, wartime disruption, and the structural disadvantage of competing without the distribution infrastructure the major manufacturers had spent decades building. There is a particular cruelty in that detail. Newton was not beaten because his ideas were wrong. He was not beaten because his rifles were inferior. He was beaten because the men who had already taken his best work controlled the supply chains, the dealer networks, the banking relationships, and the press coverage that a new entrant needed to survive. The deck was stacked before Newton ever opened his factory doors in Buffalo, and the men who stacked it had done so using the designs he handed them for nothing. Savage Arms is still in business. They produce a full line of bolt-action hunting rifles. The .253,000 Savage is listed in their historical catalogue as a company achievement. There is no mention of Charles Newton. The verdict of history on Charles Newton is not complicated. He was right about the cartridges. He was right about the case capacity and the pressure curves and the bullet construction. He was right about all of it, and he was right about it decades before the industry arrived at the same conclusions through its own slower process. What he could not survive was the gap between being right and being in business. The established manufacturers had the distribution networks, the raw material contracts, the banking relationships, and the institutional credibility that a one-man operation in Buffalo could not replicate regardless of the quality of its product. Newton needed a partner with capital and patience. He got Savage, which took his work for nothing, and left him to build alone. Consider what Newton's life actually looked like from the inside. He was a man who could see, with complete clarity, exactly what the American sporting rifle was capable of, and exactly why the industry was refusing to build it. He watched Savage sell his cartridges under their own name for a decade before he had the resources to produce a competing rifle. He watched the war take his second company just as it was finally working. He watched the post-war contraction kill his third attempt before it started. He went to his grave knowing he was right and knowing it had not been enough. That is a particular kind of defeat that does not get easier to carry the longer it goes on. Most men in that position eventually make their peace with the outcome. Newton never did. He kept filing patents and founding companies until the Depression made it impossible. That stubbornness cost him everything personally. It also left behind a body of work that shaped the next 100 years of American rifle design. The cartridges Charles Newton designed are still being chambered, still being hand-loaded, still taking deer and elk across North America more than 90 years after the man who conceived them died with nothing in his account. Savage made the fortune. Newton made the cartridges. The gun press gave Savage the credit. History is slowly correcting the record, one auction sale and one collector's display case at a time. The next time you pull a round of .250 Savage out of a box and seat it into your bolt gun, you are holding the work of Charles Newton. He never got paid for it. The least history can do is remember his name.